Welcome to the View Magazine's Rebel Justice podcast. Here we bring you the experiences of people at the front lines of justice, mental health, and creativity. Women with lived experience tell their stories, and we set about to looking for less oppressive ways to bring a justice system that is fit for everyone, that serves everyone. We invite people whose ideas are different. We are invested in building a better world. Judges are using prisons as dumping grounds and as places that can get psychological assessments for mental health treatment. But why can't these be done in the community? This week, we bring you someone at the forefront of talk therapy for the most disenfranchised communities in Ireland, Jimmy Judge. Jimmy started in the 80s as an addiction counsellor. He then went on to work with the traveller community and specialises in trauma counselling and also identifying abuse in institutional settings and in relationships where it would be easy to exploit a power imbalance. Jimmy, it's such a privilege to have you with us for a chat. First, we'd just like to know a little bit about yourself. If you could tell us about your own life and what was it growing up on Dublin's north side?
Oh, okay. Hi, Madeleine. Lovely to be on the podcast with you. I've heard some of the podcasts and I love listening to them and your interview style, as I said. But for me, I suppose we're always north side, Kilbarrack. I don't know if you know Dublin, Madeleine. You know Roddy Doyle. The writer Roddy Doyle wrote The Commitments, The Snapper. Yes. That's where they were all made there. So we were kind of there in the 70s, and then Coolock, and then Ballymun for me, and then we kind of splintered off to different places. So it was pretty much in the 70s that I kind of grew up there. So everybody was poor. There was a recession on, you know, that kind of way. As a teenager, what we were taught as working class kids was, and there's nothing wrong with getting it, you get a trade. You know, you wouldn't aspire to be anything else. You get a trade. The women would maybe become a wife or a mother, or maybe they might work in a factory. You know, but that's pretty much, you know, I know things have changed what it was. So my family trade, my uncles, and they were all painters and decorators. And I started to do that. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But somewhere along the way, either hanging around the streets, playing football, talking to people used to kind of talk to me a lot, you know, and women, Jimmy, come here, I want to talk. You know, they would confide in me and guys, hard guys, you know, that don't tell anyone, you know. And I wasn't thinking nothing about it. Like, I can talk to you. That was the thing. You know, I didn't realize that was a thing. And, you know, like most places, the streets were tough, but I wasn't a tough guy at all. You know, I could play football and I could bluff a little bit, but I wasn't tough. And I kind of survived that way by being like the therapist for all the head cases. But I didn't know that at the time, you know. So I didn't realize that was going to be a skill that would become maybe a career for me. And it did later on. It's only as I reflect back on that, I can see that. Does that make sense? I never would have thought, oh, I'm going to be a psychotherapist or a counsellor at all. Even though I had or have, or many people have, I'm not just saying it's me, what I think is the most important ingredients for counselling or therapy is not necessarily a likability factor, because not everybody likes me, but a connecting factor, you know, without effort. Does that make sense? People, you know, I was one of those people, everyone spoke to me, they speak to me on the bus. People say, you've got that kind of face I can talk to, and that. So that, I didn't realise, I wasn't thinking this is going to be, oh, I know how to do this. It's just, I thought I was just being me. And then as doors open later on, and we needed a few hours for that conversation, how I ended up getting into the field, you know, because I'm 35 years in it now. It was through a place called Ballymun, which you may or may not have heard of. It's quite a famous suburb of North Dublin, because in most cities, they have big flats complexes. They didn't in Dublin, but Ballymun was the first one of those type of projects. Huge. And it was quite controversial, and it was quite problematic. And, you know, it was open to kind of a lot of addiction and crime and that kind of stuff. But it was also a beautiful, thriving community as well. That lovely combination. So people were on the edge quite a lot, you know. And anyway, there was a local community addiction project. So I wouldn't have time to tell you all the details now, but I ended up working in that. And then they recognized this guy's kind of good at that part. He's good at the counselling part. And then they helped develop that and help fund me to get, more training. Because by the way, I left school. They kicked me out when I was 14.
Oh
So
no, why did you not behave like they wanted you to?
No,
You
I did
didn't
not.
fit the mold they
No.
wanted.
And I'm realizing that now more and more, Madalena, as I speak to men or women that have come through similar experiences who are really, really intelligent, but the education system didn't fit for them. It didn't for me. I'm not saying I'm really, really intelligent, but I'm intelligent enough. I didn't think I was. The principal of that school can you course on this?
Yeah, just be
Who fucked
yourself.
me out, right? That's what I'd say. He at times said to me, "You will never amount to anything. You are nothing." He wasn't a nice human being, and I'm always dying to get a call to go to that school to do talk on it. I work with addiction a lot as well, and say, "Hey, remember me?" But just a bit of hurt there about that.
Yeah, well, I guess it happens with a lot of us. I also feel the same in terms of where we are in life, to find people who support us and elevate us in our talents and strengths. You have shared how you fell into it, and that you were helped financially then to study and to pursue that, which sounds absolutely incredible.
Just beautiful, and I'm forever grateful for it. People saw something in me, believed in me. I came from a single parent family. My mother was an amazing woman who reared a family pretty much on her own back in the 70s, and not many people in the 70s, and Catholic. I think Portugal's quite Catholic as well. Not many people broke up. She did, and raised us with the help of some great neighbours and as well, so she's an amazing woman.
And was she supportive when you told her, or when you realized what the path you were going to take?
He was, but in a very, very funny, you should say, you picked up on something there. She's old school. She's like 84, 85 now. To her, work was going, you get dirty and you come home and you have your dinner. She didn't realize for ages this was a job. She thought it was some kind of voluntary, I was doing volunteer work in the Simon community at the time as well, in connection with homelessness. And, marginalized people began there as well. Because I always felt I was one. So it was identification. And growing up in and not having the dad, so as to speak, and feeling that kind of stigma and connecting with people who felt the same. And again, I can reflect on this now. I didn't know this at the time. This was just happening. So, yeah. But she was, and she's immensely proud of me now, which is lovely. For years, she didn't think it was a job, She's like, when are you going to get a job? I was sitting around talking to people, drinking tea.
That's wonderful. So now we'll talk a little bit about, your experience and how to you trauma and addiction are linked. It sounds like you started very young working with people with addiction. So we'd love to hear your view on that.
Yeah, sure. Again, some of the family stuff that I'm in addiction there, which would have been part of why my father was a non-present father, kind of, and he went off on his journey, so to speak. So I was aware of it then, and I grew up, I seen a lot of it, alcohol addiction, drug addiction. I could see the kind of heartache combined with that, people being really upset, feeling hurt quite a lot. Somewhere, even as I was young, I was connecting that. What's that all about? But I just seemed to be drawn to that work. I think addiction can create trauma, and trauma creates addiction, and they're, interlinked in that respect. And one feeds into the other, I think, one definitely. So that was really, really my path. And I was in an area, as I said, Ballymun at the time, that had a high level of addiction, or it was known for that, because people were, a lot of people on the edge, a lot of people ended up in, a lot of poverty, and, people leaned into alcohol, leaned into various drugs. A lot of people weren't necessarily having problems. They just learned to use that to cope with feelings and so forth. So I became interested in that area. And even more, I'm actually, on my own podcast, I do a podcast myself. I'm going to be talking about this bit a little bit more about addiction to people, particularly to people who are not good for us. The bad boy or girl, so to speak, which is a real trauma reaction, trying to resolve something with somebody who is not nice, but somehow the child in me thinks I'm not nice and I have to get them to like me. And that complex piece is very, again, it's not a rational piece. God, why are we drawn back to him? Why is he with her or him? But God, she's terrible to him. He's terrible to her. That. Why does my mom stay with my dad? Why? I could see child can see clearly, just, that space, that's that trauma response that will stay with someone, and the kind of the love bombing from the narcissism, all that kind of stuff, yeah.
Yeah, what you said about it feels almost like cyclical as well. Like if you had trauma and you get into addiction, and then addiction just creates more circumstances that just perpetuate a life. But I am curious about something, which is, do you feel like addiction can just exist when someone has that predisposition without suffering trauma? Do you think that is a possibility, or do you think you always have to have a trigger?
I do. I'm really glad you asked me that, Adeline. Yeah, lovely question. Some people are. I remember. I'll give you an example. I was doing training in a treatment center in Minnesota. I was very lucky to get training. That's a big center for addiction training, the Minnesota model in America. And I remember we were doing a lot of these conversations, and this guy said, "Well, look," he said, "I had a fantastic family, had a great upbringing, got a great education." Don't know why I'm doing an American accent. I'll do it anyway. Everything was cool. Had some great relationships, great self-esteem. I just fucking love getting stoned, right? So there is that as well. Although I often do wonder, at some subtle level, is there something? It opens up the whole area of like, well, there's something about this planet or this being human. It's not quite perfect, So if it's not one thing, it's going to be another. I don't think there's like addiction's an expression of that imperfection. It's an expression of that. I don't know if there's anyone that's right, so to speak, whatever that might be. And quite frankly, they wouldn't interest me. I love the vulnerability in it as human beings, and the place of being able to be okay as you are, not striving to be something that you're never going to be anyway, whatever the illusion, but just find out in therapy why I got, it's fine to explore stuff, Does that, I know it's not a straightforward question, is that?
Oh no, that makes perfect sense. And it's beautiful. I feel like since the moment we were born, we're constantly trying to look for antidotes of relief, trying to just be the person that we think that everybody wants us to be, or that we think we want to be. We also know that you do a lot of pro bono counseling work with the traveler community. I'd like to share a bit about that.
I think Farah probably made me sound better than I actually am. I have the imposter syndrome. God, I don't do all that. I mean, pro bono, that's a real American term. Of course, I want to earn a living, because some people listen go, I know him, he charges me a fortune. No, I try to keep my prices reasonable, because I'm not about the money. Of course, I want money to live. But I do have a very deep commitment, draw to work with people that may not be able to afford therapy or as much, Doing it for nothing completely can feel disrespectful to people. So people often want to get something, but I'll do it, what they call a sliding scale, quite a lot, So it's just keeping the balance of getting enough of money that you get paid for, so I can then, I'd love to come into a few bob, win the lottery or something, then I just do all of it that way,
Yeah. And how is it working with the traveler community? Is it a different kind of atmosphere from other types of clients?
The traveler community are interesting because I've friends, a beautiful man called Thomas McCann, who is the founder member of the traveler counselling service, and the manager. And we've just been friends for years. We just kept crossing paths, and he started this. He said, Jimmy, would you be interested in being part of that? I mean, they'll pay you as well. You know what I mean? It's not all in that sense. But what's interesting, the draw to the traveling community is, for me, quite similar to feeling kind of working class on the edge. Like in this profession, technically, I'm not meant to be in it. I get a new client, they come to the door and they're looking at me going, where's the therapist? I just don't look like. I know I take that as a compliment. But work with the traveling community, the marginalized, the on the edge, that space, the looked down upon, As a child, I had in school traveler friends. I didn't know they were travelers. And others said to me, what are you hanging around with them for? And maybe I could identify at some level with that feeling of feeling different or whatever, as many people can. I'm not saying like I'm alone in this world, not at all. But it's a fascinating community. They're a wonderful people. They fuck up like everyone else, but they're our original people on this planet. They're the indigenous people of Ireland. I love talking to the older travelers about how it used to be. And some of the new things that have come in are great, but like the rest of the world, some of the new things are not great. Yeah, so I'm still connected with them through Thomas and a couple of others. There's actually a good podcast by a friend of mine called A Traveller and a Countryman, right? Travellers refer to non-travellers as countrymen, right? Which is a bit confusing, even if you live in the city. You get me? And Irish travellers, all travellers have a language as well called the cant or the gammon. Well, it's not a slang, it's a real language. So where travellers will be favies, non-travellers will be like buffers, but often they'll say countrymen. Anyway, my friend Dean Scurry does this podcast with Martin Stokes, who's a traveller, and they just riff about the culture, what it's like, what it's settled people, like how we perceive each other. So that's really, really interesting, just as you mentioned travellers there.
That does sound interesting. And how do they become open to seeing a therapist? That interests me as well.
Yeah, very intuitive question. Not easily. And that's where Thomas McCann, and there are others, but he's very intuitive, very skilled man. And he really pioneered that rather than trying to bring travellers into the settled world, integrate, meeting that way. Let's bring therapy to the traveller world and adapt it. Because working in the traveller community and with other marginalised communities, what I learned about therapy, rules all change. It's quite different. So again, Thomas would have really pioneered a lot of that stuff, and how you have to be culturally inclusive and aware and of how you present therapy. But there's a huge amount of suspicion, understandably. That is changing quite a lot, which is wonderful that Thomas and other travellers who are involved in the Traveller Council Service, they're saying, look, we're your people, Yeah, we've got a few countrymen involved as well, as they call them, but that's okay, Yeah,
it sounds fascinating. It sounds like also a good experience for you as a therapist. It must be very rewarding to work
100%.
with a community like that. A big question, in your view, why do you think there's still so much discrimination in Ireland?
Have you got a few hours now, Madalena? I know we've only a short. That's a very, very deep issue. I think it goes way back to the distorted Catholicism, because being Christian or Catholic, there's some beautiful parts to that, but we know it's been very distorted. I presume it's the same in Portugal and Spain, and we get that. In its origins, I think it was a really beautiful thing. I think the colonization from Britain 800 years ago plays a huge role in that, because we were an oppressed people, so it's deep in our psyche. So often, as a defense mechanism, we become judgmental and suspicious. So I think it's trauma playing out collectively, if you get me. I think that's, and there's lots more complexity. I know you get that, but put your question to me again.
My question was, in your view, why is there still so much discrimination in Ireland? Okay,
that's true. And I think tribalism, people being tribal, fear. I think it's fear. Because a lot of people I know would say, they dislike the travellers. When you get down underneath, they're actually all right. It's more ignorance. It's like with race. It's quite similar, It's like, if I can make you, if I can make you different, then I'm okay. If I can make you the enemy, if I can create fear, then that somehow makes me okay. I don't have to go into that kind of hinterland and feel a bit uncomfortable, and be curious and smell what you're like, and you can smell what I'm like, and we can meet there, So I think simple answer, I think, would be fear. I don't know if people are conscious of it.
Yeah, we're talking about Ireland, but I can see how it can be most cultures in most countries in the world right now. Very interesting subject about thinking about collective trauma, and why do we have instinctively this fear and this need of defensiveness and aggressiveness all the time between peoples.
I'll get you first before you get me, basically, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm anticipating you're going to get me. Generally, that's not real. We know that sometimes that can be real. Generally, that's not very real at all. It's an old distorted fear playing out kind of thing.
Yeah. Here at The View, we deal with women who have suffered trauma or want to support women who suffer with trauma. So I'm just wondering if you can suggest a couple of quick, hot tips of how to deal with trauma when you are overwhelmed.
That's a fabulous question, and it's one that could be, it could be an hour or 2 hour podcast on. But I suppose I would say I break it down into 3 or 4 pieces, right? One would be environment. So, and I'm presuming we're talking about adults, because again, I work with a lot of men and women who have been through the prison system as well, and women who have been subject to a lot of abuse and stuff, and men. So, generally speaking, when we're feeling overwhelmed or triggered, as the term is, or a flashback is coming in, it's generally into a younger or a child space. Right? We're not aware of it at the time. We're out, we're in a group, we're having a row, something happens, and we get that overwhelmed feeling, or, and it feels very real at the time. So we have to be aware of what the environment is, what's happening. And I'm going to use the term to remember I'm an adult. And I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I mean it in a really supportive way, meaning there's a younger part of me being aroused here. I'm actually okay. I'm not back there, This takes a lot of practice, of course. So the environment, the body, particularly to be aware of your hands, your feet, the soles of your feet, and of course to breathe. And I would say wherever you are, remove yourself. I'm a big believer in there's a big joke about this in some of the other podcasts, toilet therapy. Toilet therapy is where you remove yourself to the toilet because it's the one place you would hope no one else is going to be, right? You imagine you're just going to be there on your own. So whether you're in a meeting, a group, a family situation, wherever the overwhelm happens, get in somewhere. It may not have to be a toilet. Then you can sit and breathe. Then you can kind of go, I'm an adult man or woman. I'm actually okay. There's your younger part and you have to be triggered. It takes a while, I'm a bit afraid, Again, my body's got maybe hormones pumping through it. Maybe it's got, what's that one? Adrenaline and cortisol running through me. That's creating my heartbeat. I'm starting to sweat. I'm not thinking clearly. I could start to dissociate, And to be really, really compassionate and kind when that happens. Because it just means your system's working brilliantly. If you think about it, it's working too good, It's kind of like, I often describe it's like a bouncer, on the door of your life. And he or she is punching the good people as well, and say, don't hit them, they can come in. So the system's doing it, the alarms are going off. Great, they're working, but they're working too much. Can we breathe? The great breathing technique, there's a guy called Andrew Huberman. He's a neuroscientist. He's really good at a lot of the physiology stuff. But there's a great breathing technique for overwhelm, right? It's really, really simple, right? 2 quick breaths up the nose. Hold. Big long one out. It's that. You wouldn't want to do too many of them because you get dizzy. That's to relax. What will happen is you begin to relax. That will enable you then to refocus and orient. Where am I? I am an adult. Am I okay? Do I need to remove myself from the situation? Excuse me, So many people would not end up in prison, I feel, in that moment, had they have said, leave that with me. People often, Jimmy, if only I had just walked away. People get frightened and they maybe hit someone. We know all of that. But that short breathing is really, that's like a little first aid kit one. But you couldn't do that all day because you get dizzy and you'd fall, But it initially calms you down, then you can reorient yourself in that way and then get your breathe. It's good to just get regular breathing going anyway. And once again, that adult piece comes in and tells you the story, corrects the story, you're okay. So it's almost a bit like, we talk about inner child work. It's almost a bit like you're becoming your own parent. So I've noticed what happens is, I'm going to give you an example. This happened to me back in the 70s, right? The late 70s. I was somewhere living in the north inner city here, actually. And there were different people living in apartments. So someone came running in with a gun. Now, that was unusual back in the late 70s. It wouldn't be unusual now in Dublin or in any city, right? Where's so-and-so, so-and-so? Like, I had a baby in my arms, my friend's baby, a little infant baby, right? Everybody was freaking out, but I felt really, really calm because I was going to mind this baby. So I spoke to the guy. I said, listen, mate, he's not here, and he might be frightening the baby. And then he was like, oh, right, sorry, But the point I'm making is that metaphor. If we look after our own baby, our own child, it kind of calms you. I don't know whether you have children, Madeleine, but I don't either. But we get this. Or if you're around a young person, it's almost like nothing's going to happen. I'm not afraid of anything. So there's something about becoming your own internal parent. Again, if people are listening, it takes a bit of practice. It's very calming. I had another incident recently, right, where the house I'm living in, that we've a very, very difficult neighbour. I wouldn't presume she'd listen. She's a fucking head case, and not the good kind, right? Not the nice, lovable kind. Anyway, she got into this banging on the walls and screaming and da 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 da. She's mad, right? My adult knows that's fine, but one of the nights I got really scared, right? Really, really frightened, and I felt I was about 7 or 8, and there was trouble going on, and my heart was beating. I was so I had to. It's okay, Jimmy. I spoke to myself as if I was speaking to a young boy. You know, and some people go, "Oh, it sounds fucking," but and I immediately began to calm down, and I did the breath, and then it was fine. I'm saying, she's just mad. Don't mind her. No, you're going to be okay. That's a cliche, but you're going to be okay. I was like, okay, no matter what's going on, I've got you. I've got you. Okay.
Oh, Jimmy, thank you so much. I think that's incredibly beneficial, not just for people who have trauma. It's hard
I've
to
got
be
the
gentle
trauma.
with ourselves.
Absolutely, because we're replaying what we were told or we felt by some fucking arsehole narcissist, crazy fucker saying, you're a piece of shit, you know. So we do that to ourselves.
Yeah.
That's the real damage. I'm not saying what they did. It's what we're doing to ourselves. So we can, you know, and half the battle is knowing this is trauma. It's okay. I'm not mad.
And I guess if we're able to stop the war within ourselves, then we can stop warring with the person next to us.
I'm
And
good with the world. If I'm good with me, I'm good with the world. Do you know if I'm good with me? It's like, yeah, that's a beautiful thing, isn't it? To ease the conflict within, you know?
yeah. Jimmy, we're coming close to the end. I just wanted to tell the listeners about your podcast, which is called Twilight Conversations. So if anyone is interested in hearing you talk more, which I am, I've heard a couple of them, and Jimmy goes into a lot more detail into specific subjects, and it's very, very fascinating. So
You don't like the C word, don't tune in.
Exactly. I realize you have new medical terms that you've created.
Just to say, there's a slight change in format. The guy D I was originally doing the podcast with, he's ran into some health issues, so he's not doing them with me for the while. I thought I was going to finish doing them, but then someone said, look, Jimmy, you're good enough. Do them. So I started to interview people. I interviewed my friend Glenn Hansard. I've interviewed Dean Scurry. I'm doing one this afternoon, actually, with a guy called Sparky from Ballymun, sensational guy. And they're not all going to be celebrities as such, you know. Maybe I'll interview you for my podcast. How would that be?
I don't know if I could contribute to your podcast, but I'd love to chat with you more.
Sure, for defo. There's a thing like the idea around interviewing Glenn and, you know, people that are in the public eye as such. I know you're kind of in that world a little bit. I understand that. But there's a whole trauma around, and Glenn and I spoke about it, the fame, being seen, not being seen. What did that do to you? What happens when you're doing really, really well? Then you get dropped by your manager, your album, or you don't get that part, or they're not, you know, or people aren't looking at you anymore, or they are looking at you, and that must be, you know.
Yeah, I think it does take a lot of resilience, I suppose, but in my experience, a lot of support, because that's when you see where, you know, people's mental health can go, and looking for antidotes and the alcohols and the drugs. So, but yeah, I really, really urge everybody listening to go and have a listen to the Twilight Conversations. And just very briefly, how did that come up? So how did this podcast idea come up?
Myself, indeed, the guy who I started doing them with, D works as a therapist also, and the building I'm in now, this is my therapy room I'm in. There's a kind of a communal area where people have tea and that. I bumped into this guy D a few times there, and we joked and da. Then we started riffing a little bit. So every day we did that, and someone else was listening and said, you two should record that. And we were being a bit irreverent about therapy, which is really important to do because it can be a bit, you know, a bit stiff. And it just kind of grew from there, really, you know. So it's quite new, you know. Yeah.
And this concludes our podcast for today. Thank you very much, Jimmy, for coming on and sharing from your fascinating experience and field. If you'd like to hear more from Jimmy, head to his podcast, The Twilight Conversations. And you can go to theviewmagazine.org.uk for more information on The View. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.